Today is a very momentous day. We are just 10 short of our second century. In the 190th session, we have a wonderful speaker on a very, very important subject. Though we have touched upon different nuances of company law and corporate management, corporate affairs, but this is something we have not, specifically touched upon. We are deeply indebted to Advocate Amit for suggesting the topic and also introducing this wonderful speaker to this platform. Sir, welcome to Littles, and it's indeed our pleasure and privilege to welcome you. And we are privileged with the presence of Justice Ramkumar sir, Justice Ramakrishnan sir, and all these wonderful participants who have been in this journey of discovery and enlightenment in the last 189 session. So today we have Senior Advocate Sri Murari Raghavan sir, and the topic is shareholder disputes under the Companies Act. So this being a very informal session, we don't waste time on anything else. Directly over to you for the presentation of the topic. You can request your assistant to do the screen sharing as well.
Thank you, Mr. Shyam. And good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
It's a pleasure to be here and to share a few thoughts with you on this aspect of the Companies Act, namely shareholder disputes. This is something which has assumed a lot of importance in the recent past, and you would have seen that yesterday there was a landmark judgment from the Supreme Court in the Cyrus Mistry Tata Sons dispute on shareholder disputes. It's a very elaborate and very enlightening judgment. We'll be touching upon various aspects of that judgment as we go along. Incidentally, I can point out that I've had very excellent experiences in appearing for the Kerala High Court in various company matters. It's been very interesting and I've enjoyed it, and I'm very happy to be here. Thank you. Now, to begin straight away, the topic which I propose to take up today is shareholder disputes, as you can see here. And while there are multifarious disputes within the time available, I thought that the concepts of oppression and mismanagement as envisaged in Section 241, etc., of the Companies Act could be an appropriate topic for this evening, and therefore I'll get into that. Of course, if there is time at the end of it, we'll get into transfer of shares and other things, but this, I think, is a critical topic insofar as shareholder disputes are concerned. Please go to the next slide. Now, insofar as shareholder disputes are concerned, the first thing is, which fora do you go to? And while you had the company court, while you had the CLB, the company law board, and there was a possibility also of filing civil suits, with the coming into force of the 2013 Companies Act, now all company disputes vest in one fora, which is the National Company Law Tribunal, from which there is an appeal to the National Company Law Appellate Tribunal, from there to the Supreme Court. But now with this legislation, the jurisdiction of a civil suit to hear disputes in relation to companies and matters which are covered by the Companies Act is vested exclusively with this tribunal and taken out of the jurisdiction of civil courts. The question is also whether there could be arbitration in relation to this. The answer is yes and no. I'll be touching upon that as well as we go along, on whether there could be an arbitration in relation to a shareholder disputes. For example, if you did have a shareholders agreement which had an arbitration clause, could a party choose to go to the Company Law Tribunal, the National Company Law Tribunal, or could he choose to go to arbitration? That's something that we will discuss as we go along. Please go to the next slide. Now,
Sir, the slide change is not coming on the screen, sir. You are still stuck with the first slide.
Oh, okay. It's not moving now?
Not moving.
The first one, the shareholder disputes, and sir, your name and 27th March 2021.
Yeah.
Slide is not moved.
That's not moved from there, is it? Sorry. Because in my screen, the third slide has come.
Yeah, that's because
no.
Screen share, you will have to.
Only the cover page.
Yes, yes, of course.
Now the second.
Yeah. Shareholder disputes, yeah. Yes.
Trigger.
We can't see it here.
So if I put to sleep, you lose the call.
Yeah. Now you're able to get the...
Yes, sir. Now we have the slide with the heading shareholder disputes trigger.
Opening it up.
Okay. I'll go there. Now, basically, if you look at this set of issues, the provisions in the Companies Act 1956 was sections 397 and 398, which dealt with the concepts of operation and mismanagement. Of course, this is something which has been carried forward from the 1913 Act. It came into the 1956 Act by virtue of section 397 and 398. And this has now been substantially captured into the 2013 Act in sections 241 and 242 and succeeding sections. This almost identically reflects the provisions of 397 and 398, except for one variation, which I will also be touching upon as we go along. Please go to the next slide.
On the next slide.
There is a okay. Now, the first thing that we need to look at is what it would take to maintain a petition, because this is basically we're looking at protection of minority shareholders' rights. Of course, there is an exception where it's possible that the minority are oppressing the majority, but that's a very, very rare occurrence. So basically, you're trying to protect the rights of minority shareholders. While protecting the rights of minority shareholders, the question is which minority can really apply under sections 241 and 242 to the National Company Law Tribunal. Could it be one shareholder who applies, or two shareholders? Could they hold some couple of shareholders hold a company to ransom by filing it? The answer is no. And you will find that section 244 of the Companies Act sets out the qualifications for the application by minority shareholders in terms of this section. Now, it has three limbs to it. In a large public company, for example, where the percentages are thick, 100 members would be sufficient. Or it could be 1/10 of the total number of members, or it could be members holding not less than 1/10 of the paid up share capital of the company. These are the three limbs whereby people could apply. Now, therefore, you have three. You have 100, you have 1/10 of the total number of members, and you have 1/10 of the paid up share capital. These are the three requirements for a person to apply. And therefore, if you met any of these criteria, these shareholders could get together and make an application, sections 241 and 242. There are two variants to this. The first is in relation to a waiver of shareholders. The first requirement is a question of waiver. Now, let's assume that we don't have 10%. You have, say, 6% or 1/6 and not 1/10. Sorry, not 1/6, 1/15 or 1/20th. But you find that the company is either oppressing the majority or is being mismanaged wholly. Now, does it mean that the shareholders are without any remedy at all because they don't have the requisite number? The answer is no, because if you look at section 244, there is a proviso which says that you can apply to the National Company Law Tribunal for a waiver of this requirement. If you look at the change in the law in section 397 and 398, what was provided for was a similar waiver. But insofar as that waiver is concerned, you would have first apply to the regional director, Company Law Board. He will grant the waiver. You can thereafter make an application to the Company Law Board, saying that I have now been waived, I am making this application. So in other words, what will happen is there will be a two-pronged thing. You first go to the regional director, make an application to him, and then you come to the Company Law Board. What used to happen is you go to the regional director, he grants you this waiver, you file a writ, you stall the filing of the petition till the writ is disposed of, etc., etc. So therefore, when it came to the Companies Act, they restricted it to the same fora. What they said was that apply to the NCLT itself for the waiver. The NCLT decides on whether to grant you that waiver, and if it grants you that waiver, then you can make the application to the very same fora, and by which process you also save going to multiple fora. Now, the question that arises is, what are the criteria for seeking this waiver? Please go to the next slide, maintainability waiver, etc. Now, you would all recall that there has been a dispute, a shareholders dispute between Cyrus Mistry and Tata Sons. Now, that started the NCLT, went to the NCLAT, and yesterday you got the Supreme Court judgment. Now, Cyrus Mistry and the SP group, which he controls, did not have 10%. So they applied to the NCLT for waiver of this requirement, saying, please see this, Tata Sons is oppressing me as a minority shareholder. It's being mismanaged. I don't have the requisite shareholding. Please do something. The NCLT found that he did not make out any ground seeking that waiver and therefore refused to waive this requirement. An appeal was filed to the NCLAT against that order. The NCLAT reversed the order of the NCLT and laid down, of course, they permitted him to file this petition. They granted this waiver. And they also laid down about 3 or 4 criteria for considering whether a waiver should be granted. And the first one is whether the applicants are members of the company. That's a basic requirement because only a member can apply, nobody else can apply. So you would have to satisfy the court that these people are members of the company. So they will have to produce proof in the form of share certificates, entries in the annual returns, etc., to show that they are actually members of the company. So that's the first requirement that they need to meet. The second requirement is whether you will file along with your waiver application a draft of the petition which you propose to file. Now that petition should make out a case for oppression and mismanagement. We're coming very presently to what are the ingredients of oppression and mismanagement, but on a prima facie view, without going to the merits of the case, looking at the petition as framed, whether a case of oppression and mismanagement is made out, whether the ingredients are made out, and it's not something which is garbed as an oppression and mismanagement to get over something. So that's the second requirement which the NCLT would look at in the context of granting a waiver. The third requirement is whether a similar allegation of oppression and mismanagement has been made by some other shareholder. In other words, if another shareholder has filed a similar petition making similar allegations of oppression and mismanagement, then the NCLT will not permit a second group of shareholder to make a similar petition seeking a waiver. And therefore, because whatever needs to be done will be done in the petition which has already been filed. There's no need for a second group of persons to file it, and therefore, even on that ground, a waiver will not be granted. The fourth is, of course, a subjective thing, whether exceptional circumstances have been made out for the grant of waiver. Waiver is not a matter of course, because you have to meet a particular requirement. Now, you can't just say that I have not met the requirement, but I'm alleging something, so please permit me to. You will have to establish that there exist exceptional circumstances permitting the grant of such waiver. And this, of course, is a matter which will have to be established in facts and circumstances of each case. Nobody can lay down a hard and fast rule of what would be an exceptional circumstance. Now, there is also a second provision in relation to the filing of the petition. For example, if 100 people intend to file a petition, it is not necessary that all 100 should figure as petitioners. It becomes a very cumbersome petition if you're going to have 100 petitions. So there is also a provision which enables some shareholders, maybe 10, 15, to get the consent of the rest. That is available in section 244(2) of the Companies Act. They can obtain the consent of the other shareholders to file the petition, and they can file it with the consent, because along with the petition, you need to file the consent. Now, insofar as this consent is concerned, what would be a valid consent and what would not be a valid consent was a matter which was being debated but this is something which was ultimately decided several years back by the Madras High Court, and there are other judgments following it, but we seem to proceed on the same lines. So this is what this is. In MC Doraswamy versus Shakti Sugars, they envisage, because it's a matter which came to the single judge and then went to the division bench, they envisage that the consent could be in two forms. The shareholders could sign the consent form. There's no specific form. It's a letter. It's a letter whereby they consent to the filing of the petition. Now you could annex a draft of the petition along with this consent letter, and the shareholders could sign on the draft petition, which is good enough, which means that they have consented to the filing of the petition on the grounds mentioned in the petition and for the reliefs which are sought for in the petition. So that is one way in which the consent can be filed. The second one, and which is more tricky, and which is why, in fact, in that case, the Madras High Court did hold that there was no valid consent, because they made a distinction between the filing of a petition and the filing of the petition. So in a case, and they've said this very clearly, that if you give the consent for filing a petition and for operation and mismanagement under the then 397, 398 of the Companies Act, that's of no consequence, because the court will not know whether your consent which you're given has been for the petition which is actually placed before them. You only said I consent for a petition. So that is not good enough. You would have to consent for the filing of the petition, in which you'll have to itemize the acts of oppression and mismanagement which are sought to be made out and the reliefs which are sought to be asked for. So you should say, I'm filing the petition, which is a petition for on the ground of oppressive acts A, B, C, D, and the reliefs A, B, C. And so long as the petition which is actually placed before the court tallies with what is contained in those letters, then it's treated as a sufficient consent for the filing of the petition. So these are the requirements of the consent and the basic qualification for maintaining such a petition. Please go to the next slide on oppression. Now let's come to the actual ingredients of oppression. Now I'm going to read from the section and then take you through the judgments, etc., etc. Section 241 of the Companies Act deals with oppression. I'll come to mismanagement a little later. This was almost the same wording as was contained in Section 397 of the Companies Act. And this is what it says. A member of a company who complains that the affairs of the company have been, and I'm leaving out the words, or are being conducted. It's there in this section, but I'm leaving it out for now. I'll come back to it. In a manner prejudicial to public interest, that is one limb. Manner prejudicial or oppressive to him, that is to the shareholder, or any other member or members, or in a manner prejudicial to the interests of the company. So these are the three requirements that will have to be met for this. It has to be prejudicial to public interest, prejudicial or oppressive to the petitioner or any other member of the company, or prejudicial to the interests of the company. Now, the wording you will find is a little wide and broad. Now, does this mean that, and prejudicial is a matter which is a very, very subjective thing. Now, this is recognized as an extreme step because you're actually asking a tribunal to interfere with the functioning of a company. The normal rule is in a company, democracy prevails. The majority rules. What they decide will be the business of the company. If they decide to sell a property, that's a majority decision. If they decide to go in for a new business, that's a majority decision. If they decide, for example, to appoint a person as a director or to remove a person as a director, that's also a majority decision. And that is the way in which companies operate. It's a majority rule in democracies. A corporate democracy has to be maintained because that's the way in which a company can function. You can't ask a court to supervise the functioning of the company. So this is recognized as an exception to that, where the minority can request the court and now the tribunal to interfere with the functioning of the company. And they could point out that the company is being managed in a manner which is prejudicial to any of these three limbs. Now, what is this prejudicial has come up for consideration in various cases. So one of the earliest, of course, we have actually borrowed this substantially from English law with a small variation. And the Supreme Court judgment in Tata Sons, which came out yesterday, contains a very interesting narration. I would request all of you, when the time comes, when it's available, please read that judgment. It's a very long judgment. You don't have to go into the facts of that. You just read the legal provisions, because they trace the history of these provisions under English law. They trace the history of these provisions under Indian law, and they pointed out how Indian law has made a small change from English law insofar as these are concerned. Now, basically what they say, and this is where it starts from the Shanti Prasad Jain case, which is one of the earliest cases. It's a judgment of the Supreme Court. They say that this oppression happens when there is a lack of probity and fair dealing in the affairs of the company. If it can be established that the majority's dealing is not fair and lacks probity, fraudulent conduct which is surreptitious. They're doing surreptitious behind the back of everybody else. Directors band together and act as a group and make sure that shareholders are deprived of some benefit, they get a benefit to themselves. The three expressions used, and they say you must use these principles to use, is harsh, burdensome, and wrongful. And this is not an ordinary thing. You will have to establish exceptional circumstances exist, which are harsh, burdensome, and wrongful, and which require a court to intervene and set right this course of this prejudicial conduct of the majority or the board which they control, etc., etc. Now, the second judgment, this again went from the Madras High Court to the Supreme Court, is a judgment in lead industries. I'm not troubling you with the citation because I've given it in the PowerPoint. This follows the Kalinga Tube's judgment on what is harsh, burdensome, and wrongful. They've added two principles to this. In fact, one salient principle which they found, which is applicable, is merely because there is an act which is illegal, you can't say it's oppressive. If you violate, say, a provision of the Companies Act, a shareholder can't come and say, see, he's done something oppressive, because there are ways to punish under the Companies Act an illegality. So that can't per se constitute oppression. It may be oppression or it may not be oppression. Similarly, it doesn't mean that every legal act will automatically not be oppressive. Merely because you followed the procedure in the Companies Act of holding a board meeting and passing a resolution, it doesn't mean that merely because you've done it and the board has passed a resolution authorizing, say, a sale of a company's property at some ridiculously low value, it is not oppressive. So therefore, there's a clear distinction between what's legal, what is oppressive, what is illegal, and what is not oppressive. So that distinction is to be maintained. But Supreme Court also adds this caveat there, saying that a series of illegal acts, one after the other, could constitute evidence of such oppressive conduct on behalf of the majority shareholders. Again, they use the same words: probity, conduct, unfair, and which causes prejudice to the shareholder. These are some of the requirements of these. Now, I'll now come straight away to the last. There are a number of other judgments on this. I'll come straight away to the latest judgment, which is the judgment of the Supreme Court in the Tata Sons matter. As I pointed out, this judgment, in the initial part, it's a very long judgment. I would please take your time and read it. You will find the initial part, they bring out what is the provision in the English Companies Act, why these, they trace the history, why these positions came about. They trace the history of a company which operated without any regulation. And the shareholders were forced to submit to a conduct which they could not complain of. So therefore, the legislature in England thought it necessary to include those provisions of the Companies Act. When we started developing companies here in India, the same provision came into 1913 Act, it became all the more relevant in the 1956 Act because that's when corporates and corporate actions started growing and is now culminated in the 2013 Act. Now, this is the distinction which you'll find between the law that existed in the 1913 Act and the 1956 Act and what has come today into the 2013 Act. You see, the basic principle behind oppression and mismanagement is that it is not intended to rake up the past, but to redeem the future. I mean, what has happened in the past has happened. That's not the intent of this. The idea is to set right the future course of action of a company and to put it beyond this. That will be used as evidence of action, but the NCLT or the court would pass orders to put an end to the matters complained of, set right matters in future. And therefore, the wording of such of the 1956 Act was this: the affairs of the company are being conducted in a manner to resolution, which means that till the date when the petition was filed, there must be a continuous course of conduct. There can't be a single act. It's not enough to have a single act. There has to be a continuous course of conduct leading up to the time when the petition is filed, which should be addressed. You can't complain of something which happened in the past. Now, this is creating quite a bit of problems for shareholders because there was no disclosure. The directors could suppress vital information. You don't become aware of it till very much later. And then when you file it, the directors will say, sorry, these are all past acts. There's no it doesn't continue till today. You can't maintain this petition, which means that several illegal acts would pass muster by virtue of this rule. So therefore, under the 2013 Act, we made a small distinction to this. And we've said the affairs of the company have been or are being conducted, which means that past can also be looked at. One is the present, you can look at the past. Now, there have been some judgments of the NCLT which said what this means is, yes, it could have happened earlier, but the effect of that should continue till the date of the filing of the petition, which would again sort of dilute the whole purpose of this requirement. Now, this provision came up for consideration in the Tata Sons judgment, where they looked at these words and they've said that this could also deal with past acts. Have been means you can deal with past acts, but you can't go and dig into conduct which happened in the distant past. It doesn't mean you go way back, you go back 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, and start digging up matters which no longer exist. So therefore, they made a distinction and said, yes, you can now look at past conduct, but don't go into conduct in the distant past. Again, of course, what is the distant past and what is not so distant remains to be seen from the facts of each case. Now, you will also see that there are some actions which have happened in the past, but whose effect continues till this date of filing the petition, which also fall within this. For example, if I'm a shareholder in a company and my shares are fraudulently transferred without my consent to some other shareholder. Now, it has happened in the past. But the effect of that continues till date because I'm still not a shareholder. My shares have been illegally taken away. So could they come back and say, sorry, we took away your shares, that's over. No, you can't complain. No. If you can establish that it did happen in the past, the effect continues till the date of filing the petition, notwithstanding all of this, you can still complain that this conduct is oppressive to the shareholder and needs to be remedied. Now, I've referred to some other judgments, like V.S. Krishnan versus Fort High Tech Hospital, where again they've come into what could be oppressive. They use the same language. This continues from year on year. Conduct is harsh, burdensome, and wrongful, malafide, lacks probity, lacks good conduct, and is intended to create loss for a shareholder. I'm not troubling you with this. Now, I'll come back straight away to the Tata Sons judgment, because that's very current. If you don't mind, I'll spend some time on it. Now, in this Tata Sons judgment, as you've seen, of course, the NCLAT granted waiver to Mr. Mistry to file this petition. So what happened is, based on that waiver, it went back to the NCLAT and he did file a petition. Now, when he filed the petition, he complained about the various acts of the majority specifically Ratan Tata and the other majorities, saying that they've done acts which are contrary to the interests of the company. For example, that nano car, several things, etc., etc., etc. And he filed this petition complaining about it. The NCLT rejected the petition. He also complained about his ouster as executive chairman of the company, because he was the chairman. Now, he went around complaining about everything, so they removed him as executive chairman. He complained about that. NCLT found no merit in the case and rejected it. He filed an appeal before the NCLAT. The NCLAT allowed his appeal, restored him as executive chairman, though there is no specific prayer for that. He never asked to be restored as executive chairman. And specifically, we will find that his tenure as executive chairman had expired by the time that matter came up with the NCLAT. Notwithstanding that, NCLAT directed that he would be restored as executive chairman for the remainder of his tenure. They also granted several other reliefs insofar as the petition was concerned, and therefore the matter went to Supreme Court. It was a major argument on whether such a thing could be granted. So the Supreme Court has said this. This does impact the law, which we have understood it to some extent thus far. But they've said this, that the removal of a person as executive chairman cannot constitute oppressive or prejudicial conduct. Because the board has chosen, for whatever reason, to remove as executive chairman, that per se will not constitute oppressive conduct. And they've also said this, that the conduct complained of should be in your position as a shareholder and not as a director. Of course, there's an exception which doesn't appear in this case, but if you have small family companies, you have companies which are in the nature of what they call quasi-partnerships. They are actually partnerships which started as such. Then, as business grew, they chose to convert themselves into a private limited company. But nevertheless, they maintain all the characteristics of a partnership in that all of them have been management. It's a board managed company. Everybody's participated in management. And it's been functioning as if it's almost like a partnership, though they chose to adopt a corporate status. So in those cases, courts have held that the removal of a director and excluding him from management in a family company where all the family members get together, or when it's a partnership which got converted to could constitute oppressive conduct. Of course, it depends on the facts of that case. If, for example, the director has been siphoning out monies of the company and he is removed, then it can't be said that the removal is bad or oppressive. But on the contrary, if this director finds that there is a wrongdoing by the other directors and he asks questions saying, why did you do this? And they remove him for that. So to stop him from asking these questions, then that could constitute oppressive conduct. So that again is a matter which applies from case to case. Now, that is what we have dealt with is section 241(1)(a), which is oppression. And we'll come to the reliefs which can be granted. But before we do that, let's go into the second concept of mismanagement. Now, you have two sections, 397 and 398 of the Companies Act. 397 dealt with oppression, 398 dealt with mismanagement. When the 2013 Act came into force, they put it into one section. 241(1)(a) is oppression, 241(1)(b) is mismanagement. Now, the requisite of mismanagement is this. While you have all the elements of lack of probity, conduct, etc., etc., insofar as mismanagement specifically is concerned, what it refers to is a change in the management has taken place, And that change is likely to prejudicially affect the functioning of the company. Now, there are two limbs to it. The first is something which has happened. The second is what is likely to happen. The first is that a material change has to take place in the management or control of the company. The shareholder A was nominating the majority of the directors, and they were managing the companies. Now, by reason of certain circumstances, shareholder A no longer nominates majority of the directors. The nomination takes place in some other manner. So a material change has taken place in the management of the company. Material change has taken place in the management of the company. Now, this material change is likely to affect the functioning of the company. So that is, in other words, it is likely the affairs of the company will be conducted in a manner prejudicial to the interest of the members. So these two twin requirements have to be met. The second one, of course, is subjective, and you will have to establish that these people are competitors to the company. If they get into the management of this company, they will try to undermine this company to help their own company, etc., etc. These are matters which are likely to prejudicially affect the interests of the company as a result of change in management. So if these twin requirements are met, then you can maintain a case for mismanagement of the company. And I've gone into what is a fiduciary duty. Please go to the slide. It says shareholder disputes mismanagement, fiduciary duty. There are two judgments which I've referred to. One is Sangram Singh Gaikwad and Dale and Carrington, which say that you see, in fact, there are slightly different versions of these two judgments. One is that the directors owe duty to the shareholders. And that duty means that they will issue shares only for the proper purpose. That is the principle in Dale and Carrington. When it came to Sangram Singh Gaikwad, they say that more than the duty to shareholders, they owe duty to the company. They have a fiduciary relationship with the company. They must not benefit or misuse the fiduciary relationship which they have with the company to benefit themselves. So that is the requirement of these two requirements. These are the examples of what could constitute a lack of lack of bona fides on their part, which could result in mismanagement. Now, let's go into what is the relief which an NCLT, you made out a case for oppression. You made out a case for mismanagement. You go to the NCLT asking for relief. Now, what is the relief which the NCLT can grant? Before it grants a relief, it needs to satisfy itself on two requirements. The first requirement is that you must make out, and this you will get in section 242 of the Companies Act. First, the NCLT must be satisfied that there is either oppressive conduct or mismanagement. So that's the first requirement which you will have to satisfy. Because if you don't meet that, you're not made out a case for oppression and mismanagement. But that's not enough. Merely making out a case for oppression and mismanagement does not ipso facto automatically entitle to relief. You have to satisfy a second requirement, and that you will find in section 242 1B, which says that to wind up the company would unfairly prejudice such member or members, but that otherwise the facts would justify the making of a winding up order on the ground that it is just and equitable that a company should be wound up. Now, this is an important requirement that you must lead the NCLT to the situation where it feels that the company deserves to be wound up, but to do so will unfairly prejudice any member of members. Now, this winding up is not a winding up as we understand it for inability to pay debts, etc., etc. It is a winding up on the ground that it is just and equitable to wind up that company. You must come to a conclusion that it is just and equitable to wind up the company, But if I did so, these members will be prejudiced, and therefore I must grant this relief. So these are the twin requirements to be met. Now, what is a situation in which NCLT could come to the conclusion that it is just and equitable to wind up the company? The first is a deadlock in management, a factual deadlock in management, where, for example, and you will find this in any number of family companies, you'll find two groups of family members holding 50% each in the company. You'll find that the board consists of equal number of representatives on both sides. Now, it is most common, and this is possibly the most common applications for oppression and mismanagement which are made out in relation to family companies. Because very often the dispute is something which is outside the company. It gets translated to a dispute in relation to the company because family members have their own, let's say, for want of a better word, I'll say egos vis-a-vis each other. And somewhere something goes on, you realize it reflects on the company. And what really happens is if you have this equal shareholding, equal directorship, then there's a complete deadlock when these two family members cannot have. There's no business you can do. There's no majority resolution you can pass. Everything I say, you vote against. Everything he says, I vote against, either at the board or general body level. So what is the company to do? It can't progress. So in those circumstances, that's one of the grounds where it is found to be just and equitable to wind up the company. And a relief which could be granted could be any of the reliefs which are envisaged, which are company. The second type of just and equitable is where there's no actual deadlock in that sense. But you have two groups of shareholders who have lost mutual trust and confidence in each other. Maybe I'm a majority or a minority, or you're a majority, I'm a minority. But because of various acts which have been undertaken, we have lost mutual trust and confidence in each other. So what used to happen? We can't function. So there must be some action which has to be done. And you will find that in all these cases, what the NCLT does generally, and which has been approved in almost all cases, is directing one group of shareholders to buy out the other. Generally, they say, for example, if you look at Dale and Carrington, they say that where the majority is oppressing the minority, asking the majority to buy out the minority means you're giving them a premium on acts of oppression. That should normally not happen. But subject to that exception, one group has to buy out the other. One group of family members buy out the other group of family members. There's a valuation which is done. That's a normal thing. There could be other methods of using this. For example, where there's a deadlock, it's possible for the NCLT to appoint one more director to chair all meetings of the company, and with a casting vote. So that if there's a deadlock at the board level, then this man exercises a casting vote and breaks it. Likewise, this chairman of the board could also be chairman of the general meeting with a similar casting vote. It's generally an independent, respectable person who runs a company who is appointed to this post, maybe for a limited period, to see if the deadlock, etc., could be. So these are situations in which just an equitable winding up is justified, but because of the prejudice it will cause the shareholders, this is treated as an alternative action. In fact, today in Companies Act, you have provisions which permit a person to go to the company court in a high court, or now it's the NCLT, under the Companies Act, saying this company should be wound up on the just and equitable ground. Now, it's possible for the company court to wind it up. Or it could say, sorry, you have an alternative remedy of oppression and mismanagement, please go under that provision. So that is also available to the NCLT, refusing to wind it up and say go under. So all depends on the facts and circumstances of each case. For example, if the entire substratum of a company is gone, the entire business, it had one factory outlet. The bank took it away, sold it in an auction, and took it away. There's no asset. You can never do business. Wind up the company. But if that is not the case, and there's a possibility of the company carrying on business in future, then go for the alternative. The leading judgment on this is Rajahmundry Electric Supply Corporation was Nageshwar Rao, which has been it's again a judgment of the Supreme Court. This has been cited with approval in the Tata Sons judgment, which came out. Now, what is the kind of power what is the kind of relief which can be granted? You will find that under 242, the requirement is that the tribunal may, with a view to bring to an end the matters complained of, make such order as it deems fit. Now, therefore, there is no specific limitations prescribed on what kind of orders you can pass. You can pass an order which, in the view of the NCLT, will bring to an end matters complained of. In other words, the oppression or mismanagement should come to an end. It should not continue in future. What you need to do to make that happen is a kind of order that you pass under section 242(1). Now, in other words, the Bennett Coleman case, which is cited, it's a Bombay High Court judgment reported in 47 company cases, where they say that the limitation which arises is a nexus between the order that is passed and the object that is sought to be achieved. Now, this again came up for consideration in the Tata Sons case, because Tata Sons was considering, the Supreme Court was considering the issue in Tata Sons on what could be with the kind of relief. Is it unlimited? Can you do anything in the whole wide world? Or are there certain restrictions on it? Here they've said this. They've said that the reinstatement of a director or an executive chairman is not envisaged in 241. It's probably contrary to section 14 of the Specific Relief Act, which says that you cannot specifically enforce a contract which requires personal service. The executive chairman would be in that category, and therefore reinstatement of the chairman under 241 or 242 is not something which can normally be granted. The second thing they've said is you must keep in mind the fact of the objective behind the thing, because the idea is not to create a problem for the company. The idea is to assist the company in carrying on its business in future. You can't permit one group of shareholders, for whatever reason, to hold at ransom the company by threatening to disrupt the entire board, etc., etc. The interests of the company are paramount. The shareholders' interests must be kept in mind. The interests of the company are paramount, and you should pass such orders as would be in the interest of the company, keeping in mind the complaints of the shareholders. That seems to be the point. Now, one other aspect we need to bring down, and I've referred to two of these requirements, namely, Companies Act, companies' affairs are being conducted in a manner which is prejudicial, oppressive, and it is just and equitable to wind up the company. Now, what happens if such a case is not made out? Does it mean that the NCLT should dismiss the petition, or does it have any kind of a relief? Now, these are basically reliefs of an equitable nature. Of course, there is a line of judgment which says for seeking such equitable relief, you must come to court with clean hands. So that's one part of it. But having done that, you have not actually made out a case within the rigors of this section. So what is to happen? Needle Industries comes to this. They say that even though a case of oppression is not made out, the court is not powerless to do justice between the parties. So that is the principle they can pass such, and ancillary orders are required to do complete justice between the parties. Needle Industries, ultimately, the petition, they found there was no case of oppression, but they still granted certain relief, saying, I'm not powerless to do it. Now, this became a sort of a controversial issue because the Supreme Court did it in Needle Industries. Now, it was felt that Supreme Court was in the exercise of its extraordinary power in the Constitution, granting such relief. The NCLT could not have granted such relief. Now, this came up for consideration in two other judgments, Sangram Singh Gaikwad, which I referred to, and Bharati Cotton Mills, saying that fine, Supreme Court has done it. That doesn't give power to the NCLT to do it because you must satisfy the twin requirements. There they said no. they said, we have said the court is not powerless to grant relief. We didn't say this court is powerless to grant relief, meaning the Supreme Court. They said the court is not powerless to grant relief, which would mean the courts or tribunals subordinate. Therefore, it is possible for an NCLT, in the interest of justice, to grant relief, though it's technically a case of oppression or mismanagement is not made out. Now, there are various kinds of reliefs which can be granted. Mr. Sham, am I running out of time? Shall I conclude now?
No, sir, you can, sir.
Okay. Okay. I'll just take another 5-10 minutes and leave it for any questions that may arise.
Yes, sir.
Now, the other issue which came up is whether a dispute of this nature is arbitrable. For example, a shareholders agreement which provides for arbitration in respect of disputes arising under the shareholders agreement. Now, it is also a case of oppression and mismanagement. Can I go to arbitration for it? Now, there are two views on that, where they say that if your disputes strictly fall within the parameters of the shareholders agreement, though ideally it could be a case of oppression also, you're free to, you should go to arbitration. And in fact, some matters have been referred to arbitration, saying this technically falls only within the scope of the shareholders agreement. There's nothing outside it, nothing generally in relation to the company's affair, no oppressive things. All you're alleging is a breach of a term of a shareholders agreement in your capacity as a shareholder. There they said, yes, please go to arbitration. But if it is not falling within this compartment, you have disputes within maybe a shareholders agreement, there are broader disputes between the parties, then you can still maintain an application for oppression or mismanagement, notwithstanding the fact that there may be an arbitration clause in one of the agreements which you have signed. And you will have to remember two things. One is, an arbitrator is a creature of a contract. He is bound by the terms of the contract, or any event is to take into account the terms of the contract, even if you look at the amended Arbitration Act as it now exists. He cannot wander outside it. He can't grant a general relief which is not claimed, etc., etc. NCLT is not hampered by that. We have seen the powers of an NCLT under Section 242 of the Companies Act. It can pass such order as it deems fit. The only limitation being it should be in the context of putting an end to the matters complained of. Therefore, to grant relief, if you look at the subsection 2, they talk of the powers which it can grant without prejudice to generality of such powers. These are basically illustrative and not exhaustive, and I'll come to only one aspect of that a little later. But if you look at it, they have the widest possible powers subject to this one limitation. An arbitrator can't do it. So therefore, if you made out a case for oppression and mismanagement and you seek the interference of the NCLT for the exercise by it of the powers under 241 and 242, then notwithstanding the existence of an arbitration clause, the NCLT will exercise jurisdiction recognizing the wide powers it has, because it is looking not just as a dispute under a particular agreement, but how to set right the company's affairs in the future. And therefore, in this context, it would retain the matter and not refer it to arbitration. With this caveat, that if actually it is nothing but an arbitrable dispute which you have dressed up to make it look as a case of oppression mismanagement, then the NCLT will say, sorry, because of this fancy drafting which you have done, I'm not going to exercise jurisdiction. This is nothing but an arbitrable dispute. Please go back to arbitration. So this is the relation of arbitration vis-a-vis the NCLT. I'll only deal with one relief in relation to powers, and then if there are any questions, I'll be happy to take them. Now, while in section 242.2, while it refers to the fact that these are without prejudice to generality of the powers in subsection 1, there's one provision which introduces some limitation, that is subclause G, which says, and this is very important because it comes up for consideration in civil cases. The setting aside of any transfer, delivery of goods, payment, execution, any other act relating to property made or done against the company within 3 months before the date of the application, which would, if done against the individual, be deemed in his insolvency to be a fraudulent preference. So therefore, where there's a transfer of goods, property, etc. by a company, then the limitation which is built into this section is that you should challenge it within 3 months of that happening. I'm assuming that if it's a surreptitious deal, you can extend this to say 3 months from my becoming aware of this surreptitious deal. But that's the 3-month requirement. The second requirement restriction is it should be deemed to be a fraudulent preference in an insolvency petition. Only then you can challenge it. So therefore, for the transfer of goods, property, etc., you have to meet the twin requirements of 3 months and fraudulent preference under the Presidency Terms of Provisional Insolvency Act. If that relates to, for example, you pay off one creditor in preference to another, you give a preferential treatment to one person over the other, etc., etc. So in that case, you can't say this is without prejudice, so 3 months is irrelevant, fraudulent preference is irrelevant. Case have said that once the specific requirement is met, you must meet the specific requirement. You can't fall back on 242(1). Now, one final provision which needs to be looked at is section 246, which incorporates certain winding up provisions into this. 246 says the provisions of 337 to 341 shall apply to a petition under 241. These provisions 337 to 341 apply to a winding up matter. And that is basically what they call misfeasance, where a director or a person in management has either imprudently conducted business, deliberately caused loss to the company, or has siphoned off funds from the company. In a winding up, the liquidator could proceed against him, ask him to make good all of them. Now, those provisions have been incorporated into operation because this is treated as an alternative to winding up, to show that even though the NCLT chooses not to wind you up but to go under this provision, still, if the director is guilty of diversion, siphoning, etc., he can be directed to that loss to the company. I think these then are some of the significant issues in relation to operation and mismanagement. I thank you all for allowing me this opportunity, and if there are any questions, I'll be happy to take them. I don't promise to answer all questions because you have very eminent persons who are here, and I may not be able to answer the questions off the cuff, but I certainly will, if required, research and come back to you. Please, thank you very much.
End the screen share. Stop the screen share.
Sorry? Yeah.
So you're muted.
Yeah. I just wanted to end the screen share. So
Yeah, I mean, I'll enable it from you, sir.
Okay. Okay. No.
One second. Okay, sir.
I think it's coming there. I think I'll take it from there.
Right, the screen share is off, sir.
Okay, sure. Thank you. So, if there are any questions, please go ahead.
Before we go to the open forum, may I request Justice Ramkumar, sir, for the comments, sir.
Oh, I will be the for a confirmed criminal like me. It is totally new subject. In fact, all I know of company law, all I remember of company law is about the lifting of the wheel.
Yeah.
When you are in the company of vested interest.
Yes.
Excellent.
So I'm glad you brought that because that's a very, very specialized thing. It's becoming more and more common these days because they're floating smaller companies for fraudulent actions. So that's becoming very important. Please go. I'm sorry. Please go ahead.
Yes, excellent articulation. The operation and mismanagement. It is. I remember to study that in the law college. Thereafter, I had no occasion to consider that. Thank you for revitalizing our thought process. Thank you. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ramkumar sir. Over to you, Justice Ramakrishnan sir.
Here also I am agree with Ramkumar sir because because I never sat in the company jurisdiction in the High Court, and also as a lawyer also we don't have any opportunity to deal this aspect because I was a official lawyer, not a High Court lawyer, and then become a district judge. District judge also there is no possibility of dealing with these matters because it's not coming to the district court. As Ramkumar has said, vividly remembering the lifting the corporate veil of the company for the purpose of mismanagement being brought out. That is the only thing vividly remembering about company law. That too of law college level. That is only we can say. It is really it's a thought-provoking because every time the company law nowadays, the companies are being floated and also vanishing sometimes. So at that time, how far the company, the what do you call the integrity of the company, which is being floated on one for one purpose or other purpose, and attracting the shareholders ultimately fraudulently or otherwise defeating the rights of the shareholders and put the shareholders in a dilemma. These are all always we are seeing the what you call newspapers and other thing. Starting from Arshad Mehta and then this is how we know about company. That's all. Anyhow, it's a good thing that you have done. It's a thought-provoking presentation and also information for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
One small doubt. Supposing the twin requirements are satisfied
Yes.
in an arbitral proceedings, and can there be an agreed order for winding up?
No, sir. An arbitrator has no power to wind
No
up.
power. Okay.
Because that's exclusively with the tribunal. It was with the company court, now it's with the tribunal.
Supposing the NCLT has passed an order, will an appeal lie to High Court from that?
It will lie to the NCLAT, the National Company Law Appellate Tribunal.
High Court has nothing to do with that.
From there to the Supreme Court.
I think in the Tata's case, there was some intervention by the Delhi High Court also, it appears. There was some, no.
See, what is happening is in some cases, 226 and 227 are being exercised where the NCLT has gone beyond its jurisdiction and dealt with extraneous matters, but you'll find that's more common in IBC cases, which is now today's thing. IBC cases, the NCLT is confined to the provisions of the IBC.
Okay.
What they do is they go and pass orders under the PF Act, under the PMLA, etc., etc. So there, high courts have intervened. 26 or 7 saying improper exercise of jurisdiction. Otherwise, it goes through this route.
And not the Chandrakumar principle, it is not.
No,
The-
yes.
Thank you, Ramkumar sir. Over to you, Vijay.
Oh, hello, Shyam. Sir, it was an excellent articulation. The moment I saw this subject, I had one doubt. See, you were speaking about democratic corporate functioning. In a two-member companies, normally when there is certain dues which are to be recovered, certain dues to the company, and one is not acting in favor, you have pointed out that a company could be wound up. I was wondering what happens to the amount recoverable to the company by this time, because there is no board resolution which is enabling one party to file a case for recovery. What happens to the amount recoverable to the company? Is what I was wondering. In a deadlock.
In those cases, you see, it may be wound up where, for example, there's no business of the company at all. But in a case like what you're pointing out, generally the company will not be wound up. What the NCLT will do will be under 241, 242. It'll either, where two people are there and they can't see eye to eye, they can't do anything. It'll either direct one person to buy out the other. And then so that person, in fact, he can't buy it himself, but he has to find somebody to buy it. So they can then function together. Or it will appoint a third director to break the deadlock so that the business of the company can be. So those are the reliefs which could be granted in a two-person company, which is very common. I've seen cases where father and son, two-person, they fight, nothing happens. Unfortunately, that's the...
Yes, sir, but the doubt is what happens to the outstanding amount. what I was wondering, because by each time there's a limitation which would come in so far as to the advantage of the third party.
Now, see, if there's amount which is due to the company, and for example, in a case like this, they choose not to recover it for whatever reason, then possibly you can move the NCLT and also seek an interim order saying that this is going to be time barred. Possibly permit the filing of a case to recover the money. The second is something else, which is which is called a derivative action. One shareholder who feels that the company is not able to do something like this, like recovering the money, can sue on behalf of the company, saying this is what is called a derivative action, because the company, either wrongdoers are in control or there's a deadlock, the company is not able to do it, limitation is going to apply. So you file a derivative action against that person saying, I'm suing on behalf of the company, please repay this money to the company.
No, will it not in such cases? No, will it not in such cases the appointment of a liquidator arises?
No, sir. That will be a final. See, finally, if it goes into winding up, a liquidator will be appointed. But by the time that process happens from Mr. Vijay's query, it's possible that the claim could get time barred. Of course, in the winding up, the time from the date when the petition is presented till the date it is wound up is excluded for the purpose of limitation.
Yes.
So if you go through the winding up process, that is excluded for limitation. But I'm looking at the situation where the company need not necessarily be wound up because of this, but could still at the same time take action to recover the dues.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. It was an excellent articulation.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Vijay. We have Najib with a question. Najib, please unmute.
Excellent deliberation, sir. I've got two questions.
Yeah.
My first question is, sir, you were talking about that 10% threshold and 100 in number. Whereas if it's a Nidhi company, what is the state? Here also the same this thing, because it has been kept as 406 and especially in the rules and all, it's not mentioned much. So is it the same? Can you hear me, sir?
I could, but I just missed a little bit. Please, could you please repeat it?
Yeah, sir. You were telling about that 10% threshold and 100 numbers for this thing. But in the case of Nidhi companies also, is it the same threshold, or is it because in the 406 section and in that rules that nothing is mentioned there? So is it the same threshold?
If you're coming under this provision, it's the same thing.
Same thing. My second
But
question
you can
is,
always apply for a waiver if you feel that.
So that happened in this because NCLT just gave that waiver, and so but NCLT that has happened. And my second is that what about the class suits? Because the class suits, that Satyam case and all in US, that ADR was thing, everybody got the money. Here, why that people was not hesitant in not going for a class suit? Because above 100 now.
Yeah, I know. See, this is it's a very good question. Because there is this new provision which is 245, if I remember right.
Yeah, 245.
Which talks of a class action. See, this has been introduced newly into this act. It was not there earlier. 2013 Act 245 has been introduced as a class action, and it permits members, depositors, etc. The example which you're giving of a Nidhi company, instead of doing the suit, you could also go for a class action. It has its own requirements. It has its own manner in which it is to be filed. And you can file it on behalf of all of the members of that class, all the depositors, for example. You can go for a class action. Somehow, this has not assumed a great amount of popularity so far. I don't think there are too many of them, but you're absolutely right. Like in the US, this kind of a class action, now that it's available, is something that could be done. I think it's too new and too raw. So therefore, people have not really explored this to its full potential.
One more question, sir. One more question. See, if you are going for a strike, or whether it is strike for or voluntary liquidation, which is more favorable? Because is it voluntary liquidation or is it going for a strike off?
See, strike off happens when the company is defaulted. The registrar strikes you off. You don't go for a striking off. The striking off happens when, for example, you don't file annual accounts for the last 2 years, 3 years. He strikes off the company as a defunct company. That's an action that the registrar takes. Now, as far as the company is concerned, there are two processes. One is a voluntary liquidation of the Companies Act, which is the only way out. But for that, you must file a certificate of solvency.
But then,
You
sir,
can't go
that
for-
voluntary liquidation is off now, because once with the advent of the IBC, there is no voluntary liquidation under Companies Act. It is
No,
under
it's there. It's still there. It's still there.
IBC. So my
There,
question
now
was that
it's
because
section-
I am an IP, so many people are coming and asking me whether it will be better you go for this strike off or you go for voluntary liquidation. So
Yeah,
what's
no,
the advice I should give them?
Yeah, you are right. You can go under section 10 of the IBC that by a company, I mean, voluntary liquidation is also available in the Companies Act. But now they've introduced a section 10 where the company itself goes to the NCLT under the IBC and says, please wind me up.
No, that
So
is, I'm not talking about the section 10. I'm talking about the section 59 in IBC going for voluntary liquidation, not that 10 corporate.
Okay. Section 59 of IBC.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
is that
that's probably, if you're asking the difference between 59 and the striking off happens if there's a default. It's not your act. It's a registrar that strikes you off. It's possible for you to go under section 59 of the IBC for a voluntary liquidation.
because chartered accounts mostly prefer for strike off, whether legally, when I looked into it, to my knowledge and understanding, that is not the way. It has to be voluntary liquidation. But still,
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right.
thank you so much, sir.
Can go under 59, but strike off is a default position where the registrar strikes you. Of course, you can provoke it by defaulting. That's a different thing. If you wanted to, you just default and wait for him to strike you off. That's a separate thing. But then there's always one sort of the stigma which you carry around, the directors.
Yeah. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Najib. Murari sir, we have a question put by Naveen, I believe. I think he's more or less on the point, like, he says, sir, can we evolve the jurisprudence to say mismanagement as regards environment, human right, and for that matter, anybody from the society being able to come before the court with a complaint of mismanagement as regards how company deals with environment of human rights, etc. So he's trying to equate that nobody can be said to be an owner of the company. His next statement is that there is considerable force in the view that founders, shareholders cannot be called owners of the company. They are at best loan capital providers, though. The mere fact that there is some risk of losing their money cannot make them owners. A company grows by taking nourishment and support from the society. He adds, a private company has been exempted from rules and regulations applicable to public company. The question that arises is, how private is a private company? A private company takes loan from public banks, its employees comes from public society, and so many benefits it takes to grow from the public. So is the private company really private? So his suggestion or statement is that could we not have a jurisprudence developed on the basis like anybody without the question of locus standi or anything come and complain that there is mismanagement, oppression, etc. Taking this as a public body or some, I don't know to what extent that statement is correct. So your comments on that.
Even a stranger, a member of the public,
that has been
a member of the public.
As a public interest litigation.
If you ask me personally, I'm not in favor of that because you will open the floodgates to a whole lot of unwanted litigation by third parties for various vested interests. I mean, we also see how some public interest litigations get created also. There are genuine ones, but there are also a lot of these things.
Private interest.
What they call it is publicity interest.
Publicity interest. More than private interest, publicity interest.
Correct. So there, I'm personally not in favor of that because otherwise you're just, the way the companies are functioning every day, it will be dragged to some court or the other by some member of the public and put to, and what happens. So that bit I'm not in favor of. The second bit, shareholders are not owners of the company, I agree. Because if you look at the Supreme Court judgment in Bacha Gasdar case, it says that unlike a partnership, shareholders are distinct from the company. This has its own existence. For example, a shareholder cannot say that I hold 25% of shares in the company, therefore I'm entitled to 25% of the assets of the company. The assets of the company are separate. You have a right to receive dividend. You have a right to attend and vote at general body meetings. Beyond that, you have no right. And you have a right, of course, to appoint directors, etc. So that is insofar as shareholders are owners. The last one, how private is a private company? Well, see, when you borrow loans from a public bank, there are other legislations to take care of you, like the DRT, SARFAESI, etc., or even the Companies Act for winding up. Now, that is your IBC proceeds. See, there, irrespective of whether you're a public company or private company, a financial creditor who's lent you money is entitled to wind you up. Or he can take you to the DRT, or he can apply the SARFAESI proceedings against you. So there are specific remedies insofar as they're concerned. So the distinction which they're drawing between a private company and a public company is this, that you can't expect from a private company, which may be a very small company of 5 people, the same requirements and the same compliances which a 10,000 shareholder company is expected to get, because the turnover of the first and the turnover of the second is something totally different. So therefore, it is a private company for all respects. It is exempt from several of the provisions of Companies Act, but insofar as it borrows monies from banks, etc., it is still accountable. It can be held to task. Guarantees can be invoked. It can be wound up under the IBC, or a resolution process could be started under the IBC, or it could go to the DRT. Now, I think the last one he spoke about is environment. So environment, again, if there's a pollution to the environment, the person could complain under the Companies Act as a shareholder, saying that what you're doing is contrary to public interest. So that could be a thing, but no third party can come in. Of course, they are free, like they've done in the Sterlite case, etc., that somebody could take you to court, a member of the public saying this company is polluting the atmosphere, it should stop operations. It's not in the Companies Act. That is in the realm of a PI.
Environment protection.
Yes. Environment, absolutely right, sir. The Environment Protection Act, the water, air, whatever you see, you can always maintain a PIL for them. So, but that will not fall within the realm of the companies. That will be mine.
Absolutely right, sir. Sir, Justice Somayajulu sir sends his regards. He is unable to join because he's traveling. He said he'd definitely be traveling. Joining. So, sir, as we come to the end of the 190th session, may we request KVJ Rao sir to have the concluding remarks?
Yes, may I only request you to please convey my
Definitely, sir. Definitely.
to Somayajulu.
I will definitely do that. Over to you, KVJ Rao sir.
Shyam.
Yeah, Dilip, I'm sorry. Dilip has got a question. Please.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening.
Good evening, Dilip sir.
Sir, my query is not with regard to the operation or mismanagement of the company, but a different topic, that is disqualification of directors under section 164(2) of the Act. And so far as I know, disqualification is strictly against the appointment of the said person as a director of a new company, or reappointment of him as in the same company. And by virtue of disqualification, if the officers of the directorship he has in other companies shall stand vacated, and not of the offending company. Not of the offending company, but of all other companies in which he is a director, his offices shall stand vacated.
Okay.
And by doing so, would it not be preventing that director from discharging his obligations in the other company, whereby that company also would be calling for disqualification in the next financial year?
No, it's like this. See, he is disqualified not only in the other companies, but in this company also, because if you look at 167 of the Companies Act, it says that if he incurs any of the disqualifications in section 164, the office of director becomes vacant. So he vacates office not in this company, but in the other companies as well. The point is this, that the idea is to make this a deterrent. See, you can't make a director, disqualification arises in several circumstances where he has been guilty of dereliction of duty. Now, saying that, okay, you're dereliction of duty in this company, it's fine, you leave this company, but you work in some other company, is sort of putting a premium on this dereliction of duty. And that's why they have extended this not only to this company, but to the other companies.
Why I asked this question is, recently in a hearing of a batch of cases which came up in Kerala High Court, The judge was asking personally as to what happened. See, why he is not disqualified to continue as a director in the company or the offending company. And his offices stand vacated only in the other companies.
No,
And-
it's located in this company also. If you look at 167 1A, it is very clear.
I don't have the Companies Act, but
And not that it appears that once the disqualification is there, you are disqualified to become a director.
Yeah.
Whether it is irrespective of one company or other.
Except for subsection 2. So it is 164(2).
yes,
There you don't get disqualified in this company.
yes, he is not disqualified from the offending company.
In this company, only under 164(2), not in every provision of that. That is where you have where he has not filed financial statements or failed to reach
Period of 3 years.
because in those cases, there is a duty cast upon him to go and do it, to file this. You can't say, I have not filed it, I have not repaid it. No, I've ceased to be a director, I'm running away. So the reason why they don't disqualify him there is you have to carry out the duty, you have to sign a balance sheet and you have to file it.
So it is
You're
correct.
not-
He is not
It's a duty on you to repay it.
So it is correct that he is not disqualified from that offending company.
For these two situations in 164,
164(2). I am only asking about 164.
yeah, 164(2), yes, he's not disqualified.
Yes. So my question is whether by allowing him to continue in the other one and disqualifying him from the other, I mean, losing his directorship in the other companies, would it not be preventing him from discharging his obligation as a director of the other company? To make
See, if he has not incurred a disqualification in the other company, but has incurred a disqualification in this company, I don't think it's proper to allow him to continue in the other company, saying that you continue to do whatever you want. That means there's no disqualification at all. That means there is no consequence following your disqualification. The reason possibly why, and it's not clear from the act, the reason possibly why they're allowing to continue this company.
That's why I asked, because there is a confusion as to why he is not disqualified from the company which committed the offense.
Because he has a duty to perform in this company, namely file the annual financial statements and annual returns which he has defaulted, repay the deposits. That obligation is cast upon him. You can't not file it, not repay, get disqualified and run away.
Like
So-
by disqualification, he is not able to come and file the financial statements of this company also, because he has been disqualified.
No. If you've not filed the financial statements of this company,
For
if
3
you've not paid deposits of this company, you are not disqualified from this company.
Yes.
So therefore, you must file that, because otherwise you face prosecution. One is your disqualification. The second thing is, if you have not repaid, if you have not filed it, you face prosecution. You can't, by virtue of your failure, run away from it and try to escape prosecution, or escape from the obligation of filing it and thereby compounding the offense.
Prosecution can follow only if he is disqualified from this company.
Not required. If there's a failure on your part, you could still be prosecuted. You don't have to be necessarily disqualified to be prosecuted.
It is the company who is the offender. Company is
And what they call is an officer in default. They define who's an officer in default. So it's a company and every officer in default who is an offender.
I still have that doubt, because suppose he is disqualified from the other, and he is the only person who is authorized to file statement. Then the company is prevented from filing statements before the ROC in respect to the other companies. Would it not entail that company also being disqualified in the next current year, next financial year?
So that company has so far not defaulted, right?
Has not defaulted, but he is facing disqualification.
Yeah, just one minute. So those companies that company has not defaulted. There is no disqualification or a failure insofar as that company is concerned.
Yes.
This man is disqualified and therefore he ceases to be a director. What prevents that company from appointing another director in his place to comply with this requirement?
That can be done. That is to remove an obstacle. The company can do so.
Correct. So that's why that company that company is not going to default, provided it acts in time. This man is disqualified. So now I have only 2 directors or 3 directors. I am now nominating one more director. and he will comply with it. He will take care of it because there's no default. But in this company, there's a default. So you need to pin a responsibility on this company saying that you now comply with it or you face your prosecution. That's possibly why it's there. This proviso was not there earlier. It has been introduced possibly for this purpose.
And also section 164(2) says that he is disqualified from being appointed as director of a new company
For
or
5 years.
in the same company. And nothing is said about his directorship in the company. He doesn't
See,
say disqualified.
Yeah. No. That is, he shall not be eligible to be reappointed as a director in this company or appointed as a director in any other company for 5 years.
Yes.
So-
only disqualification is from him being appointed in another company or from reappointed. If he has resigned or he has, once upon a time he was the director and he is debarred from being reappointed in the same company. I understand that, but
Yeah.
as a current director, he is not disqualified.
He is not disqualified in this company
He is not disqualified.
because he has a duty to perform for this company, which he can't escape by ceasing to be a director. That could be the logic. I agree. There is some dichotomy in this.
And also, if we can cite this thing, example, that suppose I had been disqualified because of my director. I am a director for 2 companies. One company I got disqualification, or that company got disqualification, and eventually I also got disqualified. And I am prevented from taking appointment as a new director, and my office here stands vacated. Then this company also will not get a person unless they make alternate arrangements. That is not envisaged by the Act. This is a penal provision. It's a disqualification.
No, the disqualification is not for a company, it's only for a director. That's the first thing.
Yes,
As far as company is concerned, it is a company which has defaulted. Now, the default has to be made good. Now, as far as the company which is defaulted is concerned, this man remains a director. He's not disqualified in that company
he
for
cannot.
the remainder of his term, so that possibly he can set right things. Because if you disqualify him here, and the company is also defaulted, the question could arise like what you're asking: what is to happen to that company if the directors got disqualified? For example, if all directors get let me assume that this company has defaulted. What happens? All directors get disqualified, and all directors vacate office. And who runs the company?
But that company also is not allowed to file statement or correct it.
No, it's allowed to file a statement. It has to file it with a delay. It is committed an offense. That offense can be compounded, because if you disqualify the directors in that company, on that day everybody ceases to be a director. The company will have no board of that company, because everybody has defaulted and everybody escapes, and then the company is left like that. The shareholders are put to this thing. Whereas if there's another company where there is no default, then there's no disqualification of the other directors except this man. So you replace this man with somebody else. But if you do the same thing in this company, then the entire board goes on. So therefore, that's the reason for it. But this board cannot get reappointed. It can continue for the remainder of the term and set right the differences, set right the issues, call for a general body meeting. At the general body meeting, the shareholders will appoint new directors other than the disqualified directors.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, sir. Over to you, KVJ also.
Hey everybody. Thank you, sir. Very nice subject. I mean, something new for me, but I've been interested in this in the last couple of years because the Tata case, I was interested because knowing the Tata family. I mean, I worked for the Tata company at one time, Air India, and now with Air India being privatized, the shareholding patterns. In fact, the employees lost one of the bids because we were to bid for 59% and 41. For 51% and 49 was in consortium from the USA, and we lost it. So that's the little keen interest that we had in company and shares. Otherwise, like I was never into shares, having burnt my fingers in '92 with the UTI. So after that, I stayed far away from it. But it's an excellent topic. And the laying of responsibility of the directors is a very picky subject, for the simple reason is like what happened, like the Supreme Court strictures in the Tata case on Cyrus Mistry. I mean, like if the court could come up openly and say that, just because you didn't get something, you burn your own house. I mean, it's a very scathing remark, sir. I mean, if those are the kind of directors that are going to run a company, then God forbid what will happen to that company tomorrow. I mean, these people could run away with the shareholders' money, and then shareholders could be left the lurch, and Tata's name, which runs most of the show, gets maligned for nothing at all. But it's an excellent topic. Thanks, Sham sir, for having Mr. Murari over. And really, we learned a little bit. I mean, rather, I should say a lot. Like I said, for the last 2 years, I've been monitoring these two cases. And that's how I know a little bit about shares and company holding patterns. And I thank you once again for enlightening all of us, sir. Thank you for coming here. Thank you, Sham sir.
Thank you. As we come to the, I think Najib, you have something to be put. You have posted something. We are just closing. Please unmute yourself, please.
Sir, one more question. Sir, this decriminalization notification has come on 24. So how is it going to take a hit on advocates? Because most of the imprisonments or sort of things have taken away. So how is it going to affect the professionals?
Sorry, I didn't catch the first bit. What you said?
Sir, that MCA has denotified, that criminalization has been taken away, decriminalization, because in the Companies Act, so many provisions are that penal provisions was there. Along with that imprisonment from 3 to 5 years, that has been taken away. It has been decriminalized. So how is it? Because so much of litigation, corporate litigation would go away. No, how is it going to affect the lawyers?
What has happened is very relevant question. But what has happened is the fines have been increased manifold. It is not decriminalized.
Incarceration is being.
Even the fines have gone down. Even the fines have gone down. It has not been hiked. It has not gone north. It has gone south.
Several fines have been hiked. In fact, substantially hiked. Now there are still provisions. See, there are provisions that say imprisonment or fine, imprisonment and fine. For the most serious offences is imprisonment and fine, but mostly it's imprisonment or fine, and the fines are being hiked for depending on the nature of the offences.
But for big companies, sir, and all that, money to them is not a problem. So if that is only there, they'll. So how
flea
is it
bite
going to affect?
It will be a flea bite sentence.
No, and let me give you an example. For example, if you have been following the Sahara India case, you will find that Subrata Roy was imprisoned by the Supreme Court at the request of SEBI and told that you will stay here until you find a way to raise money and pay off all the deposits. So there's always something which is larger than all of this, where a securities fraud takes place, etc. SEBI steps into the picture. Well, for example, there is no precedent for this. There is no legal position for what the Supreme Court did in the Sahara case. But the larger public interest to make sure, and there the deposits are very, very small people, to make sure that they are taken care of, Supreme Court took a drastic action. So that's the way it will ultimately function.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
So, sir.
Thank you all. Thank you very much.
As we come to the end of the 190th session, let us again thank Advocate Amit George for taking the initiative in getting this wonderful speaker, Murari, to our platform. And sir, we would be looking forward to further sessions on different nuances of the topic and how the shoemaker's legacy, or which started off as both the Ramkumar sir and Ramakrishnan sir were fascinated by lifting the veil. So it is more or less like sir, step by step, we were taken through this, the way in which the shareholders' disputes, how it can be looked into, and moreover, many of us didn't have a clue of these things, for one thing, sir, because this is a branch of law which many of us may not practice also. So, but it was enlightening and enriching experience, and we are deeply indebted to you, sir, for the presentation that you had in this platform. And in 191st session tomorrow, we'll have an entirely different topic, that is drug regulation in India, drugs, especially dealing with Drugs and Cosmetic Act. Tomorrow it is at, again, please note the time, change in time. It is 10:30 in the morning. And it is, the speaker is Sri Murali Neelakantan, sir, who had addressed us last week also. So, sir, once again, thank you, Murari sir, for coming onto this platform and sharing your wisdom with us. Thank you, Ramkumar sir. Thank you, Ramushan sir. Thank you, all of you wonderful participants. So, till we meet again tomorrow, 10:30. Do take care.
Mr. Shyam,
Yes, sir.
Mr. Shyam, I need to tell you one thing.
Yes,
I
sir.
must congratulate you for taking such a wonderful initiative of arranging these lectures and keeping it going for 190 and 191. You have to be, I think, really congratulated for this effort. Thank you.
Murali, one more thing. Our request is, if anybody else is there on certain subjects which they can share, suggest the names after getting their consent. Suggest the name to the Sam Padman, so can their services also can be.
I'll pester Murari sir for that, sir.
I'll do that. I'll certainly.
Thank you, sir. Sir, this is a team effort, sir. I mean, it's a group, and the entire team is behind. I mean, the way in which everybody is involved. This is a family affair for us. I mean, earlier in the first 100 sessions, we could not wait for the next day because it was back to back every day. Then it became weekends, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, and now it's only because the courts are really. I mean, all of us are getting busy on one aspect or another, and so it's on Friday, Saturdays, and Sundays alone nowadays. So, sir, let us hope to have speakers sharing their thoughts, wisdom, and new ideas, and new avenues, so that we'll also get exposed to all those thoughts. And sir, so till we meet again tomorrow 10:30, do take care and stay safe. Thank you, sir.